In his memoir, Sandra Dee's son exposed the horrors his mother faced at the hands of her family. But the most shocking revelation was that Sandra herself was hiding the darkest secret of all. Sandra Dee, once hailed as an angel of the silver screen, began her career as a child model before transitioning to film. The blonde beauty won over 1950s audiences with her all-American charm, and even today she is remembered as the ultimate good girl. However, the truth of her life was far from this innocent image. Beneath the surface, her childhood was filled with trauma, and her deepest secrets painted a much darker picture than the public ever knew. Sandra's troubles began early. Born in the early 1940s to a teenage mother named Mary, her father disappeared when she was just a toddler, leaving the two women alone to navigate life together. But this close relationship took a disturbing turn. Mary became obsessively fixated on her daughter, a fixation that would define Sandra's future. As Sandra blossomed into a strikingly beautiful young girl, Mary's response became unsettling. She began dressing Sandra up like a living doll, adorning her in excessively cute outfits like skirts with Eisenhower jackets and little hats. Yet this was only the beginning of Mary's strange behavior. Beyond treating Sandra like a doll, she developed an unhealthy emotional dependency on her. In a particularly eerie habit, Mary insisted on spoon-feeding Sandra until she was 6 years old. When it came time for Sandra to go to school, Mary often kept her home, lying about the weather and drawing the curtains to maintain the illusion. When a new person entered their lives, the strangeness escalated. By the time Sandra was 5, Mary had started a romance with Eugene Duvin, a charming New York City real estate mogul, which only added to the complexity of their already troubled household. Mary's obsession with Sandra only intensified over time. Sandra remembered that when her mother and stepfather went on their honeymoon, she was made to sleep between them. Reflecting on this unsettling arrangement, Sandra once remarked, "Duvin always said he was going to marry both me and Mary." This situation alone would be enough to make anyone uncomfortable, but it was just the beginning for Sandra. Mary was determined not to let her daughter's beauty go to waste. By the time Sandra was 8, she had already started working as a model, with her mother seizing every opportunity to capitalize on her daughter's looks. It started out as a temporary gig for brands like Girl Scats, but by the age of 11, she was a full-fledged model. Earning nearly $8,000 a year, it didn't give Sandra any independence, which only made it more difficult for her mother when Sandra hit puberty around this time. Her mother's antics became horrifying. Shocked that her little girl was developing curves, Mary insisted that Sandra bind her breasts to prevent the changes that were coming even worse. Mary's insistence that her daughter remain in a prepubescent state had a dark and life-threatening side effect on Sandra. By the time she was a teenager, Sandra had already become the family's primary breadwinner. The immense pressure of modeling, combined with her mother's harsh and controlling influence, soon led to a full-blown eating disorder. Sandra later admitted that for an entire year, she survived on little more than lettuce. Rather than recognizing the severity of the problem and getting her daughter the help she needed, Mary only pushed her harder, worsening Sandra's already fragile condition. By the mid-1950s, Mary had set her sights on Hollywood, determined to turn Sandra into a star. At just 11 years old, Sandra was riding the subway alone to auditions, attending a performing arts school alongside future stars like Tuesday Weld, and doing everything she could to appear as mature as possible. Her break into the industry, however, came in a tragic way. In 1956, her stepfather Eugene Duvin died of a heart attack, sending the family into a downward spiral. Despite her grief, just days after Duvin's funeral, Sandra found herself at a screen test. Oddly enough, it was this emotional turmoil that won her the role. At the screen test with influential producer Ross Hunter, Sandra was so heartbroken she couldn't stop crying. But instead of being concerned, Hunter saw opportunity. To him, Sandra was the perfect package, an adorable, sophisticated young girl whose vulnerability would resonate with audiences. "I saw that moms all over the world would say, If only my daughter could be like little Sandra Dee, that would be wonderful, he later remarked. Sandra's first film was Until They Sail in 1957, a drama about the trials of love, where she shared the screen with big names like Paul Newman and Joan Fontaine. However, her casting involved a significant lie. The studio was under the impression that Sandra was 14, but in reality she was just 12. Her body was still so underdeveloped that the studio made her wear a rubber suit under her clothes to give the illusion of curves. But the discomfort didn't stop there. Having spent so much time in adult environments, Sandra had lost touch with what was appropriate for a child her age. Excited about her newly enhanced figure, she reportedly ran up to her 32-year-old co-star, Paul Newman, exclaiming, Mr. Newman, want to see my body?" Unfortunately, things were only going to get more complicated from there. Until They Sail launched Sandra Dee's career, quickly turning her into a beloved American sweetheart. This success was followed by major roles in films like Imitation of Life and Gidget, where she became the quintessential beach beauty. Gossip columnist Luella Parsons compared her innocent looks to those of Shirley Temple. However, behind this wholesome image, Sandra's life was far from perfect. Despite the cheerful, bubbly persona she portrayed on screen, the reality off-camera was much darker. Sandra was still battling her eating disorder, engaging in troubling habits like binging on walnuts every Saturday and then purging by drinking Epsom salts. In this vulnerable state, she was about to make a decision that would significantly change the course of her life. Her career was on fire when she landed a role in Come September, starring alongside legends like Rock Hudson and Gina Lollobrigida. However, it was her young co-star, Bobby Darin, who would have the biggest impact on her life. Darin, already a popular singer known for hits like Dream Lover and Mac the Knife, was immediately smitten with Sandra and wasted no time in pursuing her. He went all in, even casually proposing to her during one of their early meetings. But Sandra, unimpressed and finding him conniving, rejected his advances. Rather than backing off, Darin ramped up his efforts. First, he resorted to childish taunts, teasing her by saying, "Sandra Dee has a flea." When that didn't work, he shifted tactics and turned his attention to Mary, Sandra's mother. Hoping to win her over, Darin successfully charmed Mary, who eventually convinced Sandra to go on a carriage ride with him. This ride changed everything. Despite his earlier odd behavior, Darin explained to Sandra that his antics were due to how deeply he felt for her and how terrified he was of those feelings. His words struck a chord, and soon after, the two were inseparable, engaging in a whirlwind romance on the set of Come September. Their whirlwind romance led to impulsive decisions. Before Come September even finished filming, Sandra shocked her co-stars with a surprising announcement. She and Bobby Darin had eloped. Her quick wedding left everyone, including her older co-star Rock Hudson, and even her own mother, aghast. Despite their concerns, Sandra herself was convinced she had made the right choice, saying, "I had never felt so safe in my life as I felt with Bobby." Unfortunately, that feeling of security wouldn't last long. Sandra likely had little understanding of who Bobby Darin truly was when she married him. If she had known, she might have reconsidered. Having dealt with heart issues as a child, Darin's family had coddled him, giving him whatever he wanted. They even called him the king in the family, allowing him to grow up spoiled and entitled. His own sister admitted, "It was a mistake. We should have made him into a human being, and we didn't do it." Darin's childhood struggles with illness also fueled an intense desire to make it in show business, which led to the development of an enormous ego. By the time he became famous, his inflated self-image strained his relationships, even with other celebrities. Sammy Davis Jr. once remarked to Darin, "Let me know when you stop being a legend so we can be friends again." But Darin reserved the worst of his behavior for Sandra. Right after their wedding, Sandra quickly realized things weren't as perfect as she thought. Darin expected her to follow him around like a perfectly trained pet. He insisted that she attend every one of his shows in Las Vegas, always dressed to the nines with flawless makeup. so she could sit in the audience and gaze at him adoringly. But her loyalty earned her little in return. Even though Sandra dutifully sat through his shows night after night, Darin paid her back by ignoring her entirely. "He had me sitting through shows," Sandra recalled, "and then he was with the guys every night." While Darin spent his time with his friends, Sandra grew increasingly bored and lonely. "I had no life, and we had no life together," she confessed. Desperate for a distraction, she turned to gambling and began drinking excessively. In her growing frustration, Sandra started acting out, using petty tricks to get Darin's attention. She would do things like tell him his toupee was crooked right before he went on stage, or break down in tears, often because Darin seemed to enjoy making her cry. When asked why she always seemed to be at the center of the drama, Sandra wryly responded, "To stir things up." Before long, things reached a breaking point for Sandra Dee and Bobby Darin. Their relationship, already strained by Sandra's outbursts and growing frustration, began to crumble even further after the birth of their son, Dodd, in 1961. With the distance between them growing, Darin became increasingly suspicious of Sandra's fidelity, particularly regarding her Tammy and the Doctor co-star, Peter Fonda. Despite Sandra's insistence, right up until her death, that she and Fonda were merely friends, Darin refused to believe her and sought cold revenge. Convinced that Sandra was cheating, Darin chose a particularly cruel way to end things. Instead of confronting her himself, he had someone else break the news that he was divorcing her. It was a cowardly move, but Sandra had no choice but to accept it. However, the situation didn't end there. The couple's split was messy and dragged out. After their initial separation, they briefly reconciled for the sake of their love and their son Dodd, but the peace was short-lived, and by 1966 they separated for good. This time, the reason for their final breakup was even more absurd than before. Darin, who had grown increasingly paranoid, ended the marriage simply because he saw Sandra talking to Warren Beatty at a party. To make matters worse, he didn't even deliver the news himself. He had his psychiatrist tell Sandra that their marriage was over. The end of her relationship with Darin marked the beginning of a downward spiral for Sandra. As the late 1960s approached, she faced more upheavals. With her youthful, innocent image fading, audiences stopped flocking to her films, and her career suffered. Universal Studios, her longtime home, dropped her from their roster without fanfare. This rejection pushed Sandra into a tailspin. Up until this point, she had carefully hidden her personal struggles behind the good girl persona the public adored, but now that carefully constructed image began to crack as she started to lose control of her life. In a 1967 interview with Roger Ebert, Sandra Dee made a startling revelation, openly smoking as she sneered, "Little Sandra Dee isn't supposed to smoke, or drink or breathe." It was a bitter acknowledgement of the rigid image she was expected to maintain, but tragically, her struggles were far from over. Desperately trying to keep her career afloat, she took on a few roles during this period, often playing characters that echoed her past. One such role was that of a college student in the supernatural film The Dunwich Horror. Even though she refused to appear nude in the film's final scenes, it did little to revive her fading career or improve her personal life. In fact, things only seemed to get worse. Not only was Sandra's own life falling apart, but her ex-husband, Bobby Darin, wasn't helping matters either. While Sandra never remarried and never fully moved on from Bobby, he wasted no time trying to move forward. Shortly after their divorce, Darin met and married a secretary named Andrea Joy Yeager in 1973. Sandra had to grapple with her emotions over his new relationship, but that wasn't the only thing she had to deal with. Though Bobby tried to settle into his new marriage, his deteriorating health had other plans. His heart, already fragile from childhood illness, was failing. In 1971, he underwent surgery to receive 2 artificial valves. Despite being married to Andrea at the time, it was Sandra whom Bobby turned to for comfort during these health crises. "Bobby kept coming back and always with an illness," Sandra later recalled. As Darin's health continued to decline, so did his marriage to Andrea. They separated in October 1973 after only a few months together. But there was more to the story than just his failing health. With Bobby frequently turning up at Sandra's door, their bond rekindled, and she eventually allowed him back into her heart. Sadly, their reunion would be short-lived, ending in tragedy. In December 1973, Bobby Darin made a fateful decision that would cost him his life. Despite knowing he needed to take antibiotics before any medical procedures due to his heart condition, Darin, ever prideful, went to the dentist without the necessary protection. The consequences were devastating. He developed sepsis, which spread throughout his body, attacking one of his artificial heart valves. Realizing the severity of his condition, Darin admitted himself to the hospital, but by then, it was already too late. The sepsis had ravaged his body to the point where he began showing signs of dementia, barely able to comprehend where he was. Amidst his confusion, Bobby managed one final act of love. Remembering it was his son Dodd's birthday, he made a tearful phone call from his hospital bed to wish his son a happy birthday. Just days later, Bobby underwent heart surgery in a last-ditch effort to save his life. All Sandra could do was pray. A team of doctors worked tirelessly for 6 hours to save the 37-year-old singer and the love of Sandra's life. After the surgery, they wheeled him into the recovery room, hoping for a miracle. But that miracle never came. Bobby Darin passed away on December 19, 1973, without ever regaining consciousness. For Sandra, the news of Bobby's death was devastating. She was completely overcome with grief. Even worse, her son Dodd was spending the night at a friend's house, leaving Sandra to face the heartbreaking loss alone. In a panic, she called the boy's mother, Kay, in the middle of the night, insisting that she was coming to get him. Kay, however, managed to calm her down, advising her to wait until morning, gently reminding her, "Believe me, he'll know for the rest of his life what happened." The years that followed were an uphill battle for Sandra. As her son Dodd later admitted, "My mom never recovered from the loss of Bobby Darin." Although Sandra Dee tried to stay active by taking on guest roles, her career continued to falter. It was during this difficult period that she famously lamented, "I feel like a has-been that never was." By the 1980s, she had grown tired of the struggle and nearly retired from acting altogether. However, her retreat from the spotlight was more than just professional. It was personal. She became almost reclusive, focusing entirely on raising her son, Dodd, and trying to avoid clashes with her domineering mother, Mary, who was still a constant presence in her life. For Sandra, her family was all she had left, but even that was slipping away. In the late 1980s, Mary was diagnosed with lung cancer, and it became clear that the end was near. When Mary finally passed, she left behind one last stinging blow. On her deathbed, she reportedly told her grandson Dodd, "Don't be a victim as I was. Don't waste your life cleaning up after Sandra." Despite this cruel parting shot, Sandra was utterly devastated by her mother's death. Already barely holding herself together, she completely unraveled. Sandra's long-standing struggles with eating and drinking spiraled out of control after her mother's passing. She admitted that during this time she lived on nothing but soup, crackers, and scotch, causing her weight to plummet dangerously. Her son Dodd watched helplessly as his mother fell apart, but when she began vomiting blood, he knew something had to be done. He stepped in and convinced her to seek both mental and physical rehabilitation, a move that almost certainly saved her life. Slowly, Sandra began to recover, even showing a renewed interest in acting. However, her demons were far too deep-rooted. While she managed to curb her drinking somewhat, she never fully quit. And by this time, the damage to her body was irreversible. As Sandra entered middle age, she received a grim diagnosis. Years of self-neglect had led to kidney failure, and she now needed dialysis to survive. Although finally quitting drinking gave Sandra Dee some peace, it came too late for her to fully enjoy a sober life. By 2005, even though she was only in her early 60s, Dee was suffering from severe complications of kidney disease that dialysis couldn't resolve. On February 20th of that year, she passed away in the hospital at the age of 62, leaving many fans shocked. They still remembered her as the fresh-faced girl from her Hollywood days. But how had things gone so wrong for Sandra? In 1994, her son Dodd wrote a memoir titled Dream Lovers about his parents, which exposed a dark secret that Sandra had carried throughout her life. This secret, one she had only shared with her ex-husband Bobby Darin after their divorce and later with Dodd when he was older, was a devastating one. Since the age of 5, Sandra had been a victim of her stepfather's abuse, a horrifying reality that had haunted her for years. The trauma didn't end there. According to Dodd, when Sandra finally found the courage to confide in her mother about her stepfather's behavior, Mary's response was chilling. At first, Mary refused to believe her daughter, insisting that Duvin had been nothing but a saint. The next time Sandra brought it up, her mother remained completely silent. This revelation explained much about Sandra's troubled life, her premature physical development, her inability to care for herself, and her deep struggles in relationships. But Sandra Dee's legacy isn't just defined by what her stepfather did to her. As Dodd's memoir reveals, despite her mother's failure to protect her, Sandra was determined to protect her own son. In return, Dodd grew up to be a devoted son and loving father, showing the strength and resilience his mother had despite her tragic circumstances. And that brings us to the end of the story on Sandra Dee. That's all for today's news. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so we can bring you more stories.